Tonight, by the light of a flickering fire, we will travel to the distant past, to the deck of a ship rocking on the waves of an unknown ocean. It was a long time ago, in 1492, a time full of hopes, doubts, and faith in miracles. Imagine, 3 ships Santa Maria, Pinta and Nina leave the shores of Spain. Before them are the endless waters of the Atlantic, which were spoken of with reverence, fear, and dream. The captain of these ships, Christopher Columbus, is sure that a new land is hidden behind the horizon. His dream becomes the path along which the entire era will step. Days turn into nights. The stars above are the only signpost. The sailors whisper in the darkness, pray, count the days, losing hope. But the captain does not give up. He believes in the light beyond the darkness, in a world not yet charted. And then, one night, a cry is heard, land, and the entire crew wakes up with excitement. Before them is a new world which they dreamed of, but which they did not even guess about. And today you can just close your eyes. Let this story carry you away, not for the sake of discoveries and adventures, but for the sake of silence that is born in the heart when we listen to the voice of history. In the late 15th century, Europe was gripped by a desire to open new trade routes to India and East Asia. The traditional routes through the Mediterranean and the Middle East were controlled by the Arabs and Ottomans, making trade expensive and risky. Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer, proposed an alternative route: sail west across the Atlantic Ocean to reach the reaches of India. After numerous refusals in various countries, in 1492 Columbus received the support of the Spanish kings Ferdinand and Isabella. They allocated funds and titles. Columbus became admiral and viceroy of the new lands he would discover. On August 3, 1492, 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niga, left the port of Palos de la Frontera with a crew of about 90 people. The journey across the Atlantic was long and full of dangers. The crew experienced fear and doubt, especially when they had to sail for 3 weeks through the seaweed-covered Sargasso Sea. On the night of October 12, 1492, the watchman Rodrigo de Triana from the caravel Pinta was the first to see land. It was one of the islands of the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador, in honor of Jesus Christ, Holy Savior. The exact location of this island is still disputed. The contenders are the islands of Watling, San Salvador, and Samanique. The locals called the island Guanahani. Columbus raised the flag of Spain and declared the island a possession of the Spanish crown. He believed that he had reached the shores of India, so he called the locals Indians. The Taino are an indigenous people of the Caribbean islands, including the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti. They led a sedentary lifestyle, engaged in agriculture, fishing, and crafts. The Taino were peace-loving, hospitable, and trusting. Columbus described them in his diaries as people of great kindness and hospitality. They brought gifts, fruits, birds, gold, jewelry. The Europeans were amazed by their appearance and lack of weapons. However, even then Columbus saw them as potential slaves and wrote that with a few people it would be possible to reduce them all to slavery. After San Salvador, Columbus explored other islands in the Bahamas and then went to Cuba, which he mistook for Asia. There he tried to find the gold and riches he had heard about. He then reached the island of Hispaniola, where on December 25, 1492, his flagship Santa Maria ran aground and was wrecked. The wreckage of the ship was used to build Fort La Navidad, the first European settlement in the New World. Columbus left part of the crew there and went to Spain to report his discoveries. In March 1493, Columbus returned to Spain with samples of new plants, animals, gold, and several Taino captives. He was greeted as a hero, and the kings confirmed his titles and rights to the new lands. The news of the discovery aroused great interest in Europe. The era of the great geographical discoveries and the colonization of America began. Culture and life of the Taino people. First contacts. and their development. Who are the Taino? The Taino are the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands, including the Bahamas, Cuba, Haiti, Puerto Rico, and others. They are a people of the Arawak language group, who were the largest ethnic group in the region at the time of Columbus's arrival. Their population on the islands was estimated at several million people. The Taino had a developed culture, a complex social structure, and a rich mythology. Taino society was organized into tribes, each of which was headed by a chieftain, a cacique. The cacique's power was hereditary, but he had to take into account the opinion of elders and spiritual leaders. The beak, each settlement had residential houses, boyo, which were built from wood and palm leaves. The dwellings were spacious and intended for several families. The basis of the Taino economy was agriculture. They grew cassava, the main product, as well as corn, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, beans, and other crops. They used stone tools to cultivate the land. Fishing and hunting supplemented their diet. The Taino also engaged in crafts, making ceramics, weaving baskets, wood carving, and jewelry made from shells and gold. Taino religious beliefs were associated with the worship of nature spirits. They believed in the afterlife and performed rituals to appease the spirits. Shamans played an important role in society. They treated diseases, predicted the future, and led rituals. The first encounters between the Taino and the Europeans were peaceful. The Taino were curious and friendly, offering gifts and helping the newcomers. Columbus noted in his notes that the Taino had no weapons and were willing to share everything they had. He believed that they could easily be converted to Christianity and used as slaves. Despite the friendliness, misunderstandings quickly arose between the Europeans and the Taino. The Spanish demanded gold and food, and the Taino could not meet these demands in the required quantities. Columbus and his men began to use violence to achieve obedience. Taking captives and forced labor became the norm. With the arrival of the Spaniards, the Taino population began to rapidly decline. The main reasons were European diseases, smallpox, measles, flu, to which the Taino had no immunity, hard labor on plantations and in mines, violence and wars with the colonizers. In the first decades after the discovery, the Taino population decreased by 95%. On the island of Haiti, Columbus built the fort of La Navidad, which became the center of Spanish colonization. The construction of the first settlements, the import of slaves, and the organization of the economy began there. The Spaniards began to introduce European customs, religion, and economic systems, which led to the destruction of the traditional Taino way of life. Initial contacts between Columbus and the Taino were peaceful, but quickly degenerated into exploitation and violence. The indigenous people's culture and way of life were profoundly changed, and their numbers began to decline rapidly. In the fall of 1493, Columbus led a second expedition, which included about 17 ships and more than 1,200 people, soldiers, priests, artisans, peasants. The goal was colonization and consolidation of the Spanish presence in the New World. The expedition arrived on the island of Hispaniola, where Columbus discovered that the garrison he had left in 1492 had been attacked, and many had died. Active clashes with local residents began. Columbus and the Spanish began to build settlements, introduce European customs and religion. The first cities were founded, such as Isabel and Juan. The Spanish introduced the encomienda system, forced labor of the indigenous population for the benefit of the colonizers. The Tainos had to deliver gold and perform work, often under brutal conditions. The living conditions of the Tainos worsened. Diseases, hard work, and violence led to mass deaths. Many indigenous people fled to the mountains or to neighboring islands. Armed conflicts began. Despite the numerical superiority of the Spaniards, The Taino tried to resist, but without success. In 1498 and 1502, Columbus made 2 more expeditions, exploring the coast of South and Central America. He discovered the island of Trinidad and part of the mainland, but never realized that it was a new continent. Columbus faced difficulties in managing the colonies, accusations of cruelty and corruption. In 1500, he was arrested and sent to Spain, but later acquitted. By the early 16th century, the Taino population on Hispaniola had been reduced from millions to a few thousand. European disease, slavery, and violence had wiped out much of the population. Other Caribbean peoples also suffered from colonization, with many disappearing or being assimilated. The discovery of America was a turning point in human history. It ushered in the era of colonial empires and the global exchange of goods, cultures, and ideas. However, the price of this discovery was the suffering and death of millions of indigenous people. Columbus laid the foundations for European colonization of the Americas, but his policies had tragic consequences for the native peoples. His legacy remains a subject of debate and rethinking. The meeting of 2 worlds, European and American, was a huge cultural shock for both sides. The Spaniards encountered completely different customs, languages, religions, economies, and worldviews for the first time. For Europeans, the discovery of the New World brought not only gold and new lands, but also many unknown plants, animals, and products: potatoes, corn, tomatoes, tobacco, cocoa, pineapples, peppers, turkeys. These crops quickly spread throughout Europe, changing nutrition and agriculture. For the Taino and other peoples, the meeting with Europeans meant not only the appearance of new objects and technologies, metal tools, fabrics, horses, but also the destruction of their usual way of life, religion, language, and culture. One of the most tragic consequences was the spread of European infections: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. The native inhabitants of America had no immunity to these diseases, and epidemics took the lives of entire villages and tribes. According to modern estimates, during the first century after Columbus's arrival, the population of the Caribbean islands and Central America decreased by 80–95%. On the island of Hispaniola, where up to 3 million people lived before the arrival of the Spaniards, only a few thousand remained by the middle of the 16th century. The encomienda system introduced by the Spanish effectively enslaved the natives. The Taino and other Indians were forced to work on plantations, in mines, and to build cities and roads. They were severely punished for disobedience. When the native population dwindled sharply, the Spanish began importing African slaves, thus beginning the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted for several centuries and affected millions of people. Despite the brutal suppression, the Taino did not stop resisting. They staged rebellions, fled to hard-to-reach areas, and tried to preserve their culture and customs. However, the forces were unequal. By the middle of the 16th century, the Taino were considered a vanished people, although their descendants and cultural heritage were preserved in the population of the Caribbean islands. The descendants of the Taino, Europeans, and Africans formed the new population of the Caribbean region. Elements of all 3 cultures were preserved in the language, music, cuisine, and folk beliefs. For example, many words from the Taino language entered Spanish and other European languages: canoa, hammock, barbecue, tobacco, guava, mango. Columbus's discovery became the starting point for the mass colonization of America. Following him, other conquistadors set out for the New World. Hernan Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in Peru. The Spanish Empire became one of the most powerful countries in the world, and gold and silver from America contributed to the development of the European economy, but caused inflation and social upheaval. The figure of Columbus has long been considered a symbol of heroism courage, and progress. His discoveries were celebrated as the beginning of a new era. However, since the 20th century, attitudes towards Columbus have changed. He has come to be perceived as a symbol of colonial violence, genocide, and the destruction of indigenous cultures. In some countries, Columbus Day has been replaced by Indigenous Peoples Day to highlight the tragedy and contribution of the first inhabitants of the Americas. Modern research shows that descendants of the Taino live in Cuba, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and other islands. Their culture, language, and traditions have preserved the features of the ancient people. In recent decades, there has been a movement for the revival and recognition of the Taino heritage. Their customs, language, and mythology are being studied. The contact between Europe and America changed both continents forever. For Europe, it was a time of discovery and enrichment. For America, it was an era of tragedy, death, and the mixing of peoples. The story of Columbus is a story of exploration, courage, mistakes, and consequences that still shape our world. Christopher Columbus is a figure shrouded in many myths and contradictions. He was born, presumably, in Genoa, Italy in 1451. He received a good education for his time, studied navigation, astronomy, geography, was familiar with the works of ancient and medieval scientists. Columbus was distinguished by his determination, persistence, and religiosity. He was convinced that his mission was not only to find a new route to India, but also to spread Christianity among the infidels. His letters and diaries often contain religious reflections, references to the Bible, dreams of a crusade against Muslims. Columbus was a man of his time, ambitious, tough, not tolerating objections. His character and management methods caused discontent even among his own people. The main source of information about the first expeditions are the diaries and letters of Columbus himself. He described in detail the route, meetings with local residents, his impressions and thoughts. However, some of the original records have been lost, and copies and retellings have reached us, including those edited by Bartolomé de las Casas. Columbus's diaries combine admiration for the nature and people of the New World with a pragmatic and even cruel approach to the conquest and exploitation of new lands. He often noted the trust and peacefulness of the Tainos, their generosity and lack of weapons, but immediately wrote about the possibility of turning them into slaves and the need to submit to the Spanish crown. Columbus described in detail the plants, animals, climate, talked about the search for gold, about attempts to find the Great Khan, and about the difficulties of sailing. In Spain, Columbus was initially greeted as a hero. His discoveries were admired. He was granted the titles of admiral, viceroy, and governor of the new lands, and was promised wealth and power. However, by the end of the 1490s, attitudes towards him began to change. Spanish settlers complained about his cruelty, injustice, and inability to manage the colonies. In 1500, by order of Queen Isabella, Columbus was arrested and sent to Spain in chains. He was later acquitted, but he did not receive his former powers. Priests and humanists such as Bartolomé de las Casas condemned the cruel treatment of Indians and slavery. Las Casas dedicated his life to protecting the rights of indigenous people, wrote about the atrocities of the conquistadors, and demanded reforms. Over the centuries, many myths have grown up around the name of Columbus. He has been depicted as a great hero and discoverer, or as a cruel conqueror and the culprit of the deaths of millions of people. In popular memory, Columbus has become a symbol of courage, determination, and faith in a dream. His journey has been compared to the exploits of Odysseus and Marco Polo at the same time in the works of modern historians and writers. Columbus is increasingly portrayed as a man who opened the way to colonial oppression and cultural destruction. In the 19th and 20th centuries, with the growth of national movements, and interest in the history of indigenous peoples, attitudes towards Columbus began to change. In the United States and Latin American countries, he was celebrated as a symbol of the unification of the Old and New Worlds, and Columbus Day became a national holiday. However, since the end of the 20th century, voices have increasingly been raised about the need to rethink this heritage. In a number of countries, Columbus Day has been renamed Indigenous Peoples Day or Resistance Day to highlight the tragedy and contribution of the first inhabitants of America. In recent decades, monuments to Columbus have become the subject of controversy and protest. In the United States, Latin America, Spain, and Italy, they are being torn down or moved. And the question of how to properly assess his role in history is being discussed. For some, Columbus is a hero and discoverer; for others, a symbol of colonialism, violence, and slavery. This debate reflects the complexity and multifaceted nature of the historical process, in which there are no clear answers. The personality of Columbus, his diaries, and the views of his contemporaries allow us to better understand the era of the great geographical discoveries, the contradictions and tragedies of this time. The story of Columbus is the story of the search for something new, the clash of cultures, great hopes and deep disappointments. With the discovery of America, the so-called Columbian Exchange began a large-scale process of exchanging plants, animals, diseases, and technologies between the Old and New Worlds. This exchange affected all spheres of life and had far-reaching consequences. Crops such as potatoes, corn, tomatoes, beans, pumpkin, cocoa, tobacco, pineapples, peanuts, sunflowers, and turkeys were first brought to Europe from America. Potatoes and corn became the basis of nutrition for millions of people, which led to a population explosion and changes in agriculture. Cocoa and tobacco quickly spread among the European nobility, becoming symbols of luxury and new taste habits. Tomatoes and peppers radically changed the cuisine of Italy, Spain, Hungary, and other countries. Horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, wheat, rice, sugarcane, grapes, onions, garlic, and coffee were brought to the New World. Horses became a vital part of the culture of the Indians of the Great Plains, changing their way of life, hunting, and warfare. However, along with these achievements came diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, malaria. They caused catastrophic epidemics among the indigenous population, who had no immunity. The discovery of America became the impetus for the creation of Spanish, Portuguese, and then other European colonial empires. Following Spain, Portugal, France, England, and Holland rushed to the New World. The Spanish founded a vast empire from Mexico to Peru, built cities, roads, churches, and universities. The Portuguese established themselves in Brazil. The French and English colonized North America, the Caribbean, and Canada. The era of global trade began. Gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, cotton, cocoa, and corn flowed from America to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Fabrics, weapons, tools, cattle, and slaves went in the opposite direction. New trade routes and centers emerged: Seville, Lisbon, Havana, Mexico City, Lima. A global economy emerged that linked all continents. The decline in the Indian population led to the mass importation of African slaves. The slave trade became the basis of the plantation economy in the Caribbean, Brazil, and southern North America. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the New World, changing the ethnic and cultural map of both Americas. As a result of colonization, new peoples emerged: mestizos, descendants of Europeans and Indians; mulattoes, Europeans and Africans; Sambo, Africans and Indians. In the Caribbean, Latin America, and the southern United States, unique cultures were formed that combined European, African, and Indian elements. Traces of all three worlds have been preserved in language, music, cuisine, religion, and architecture. For example, the religions of Voodoo Haiti, Santeria Cuba, Candomblé Brazil are a synthesis of African and Catholic beliefs. New cities were built in America: Mexico City, Lima, Bogota, Buenos Aires, Havana, Santo Domingo, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo. They became centers of power, education, culture, and trade in Europe. Port cities became rich: Seville, Lisbon, Amsterdam, London, Bordeaux. The discovery of America gave a powerful impetus to the development of geography, cartography, navigation, and astronomy. New maps were created, the dimensions of the Earth were determined, ocean currents and winds were discovered, and new continents and islands were described, new types of ships, navigation devices, and methods of navigation appeared. Europe entered the era of the scientific revolution. Europeans encountered unknown species of plants and animals for the first time: potatoes, tomatoes, corn, tobacco, cocoa, rubber, vanilla, pineapples, turkey, llamas, and guinea pigs were discovered. Many of these plants began to be used in medicine, cooking, and industry. Tobacco and cocoa quickly spread throughout the world. The discovery of America destroyed medieval ideas about the world. It turned out that the Earth is much larger than ancient scientists thought, and there are unknown peoples, cultures, lands on it. This led to the development of skepticism, critical thinking, interest in science, travel, experiments. The Renaissance and Enlightenment began. New peoples, cultures, languages, religions emerged in America. The mixture of Europeans, Indians, and Africans created unique societies that today form the basis of the population of Latin America. The Caribbean, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns became the richest and most influential powers of the 16th and 17th centuries. Gold and silver from America made it possible to finance wars, construction, art, and science. However, the influx of precious metals caused inflation, social upheaval, increased corruption, and a crisis of traditional institutions. In Europe and America, new elites emerged: landowners, merchants, officials, military men. They played an important role in the development of capitalism, cities, industry, education. Many peoples of the Caribbean, Central, and South America disappeared or were assimilated. Their languages, religions, and traditions were partially preserved in the culture of their descendants, but most were lost. In recent decades, there has been a movement for the revival and recognition of the rights of the indigenous peoples of America. In a number of countries, languages, customs, and holidays have been restored, museums and cultural centers have been created. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus was one of the most significant events in the history of mankind. It changed the economy, politics, culture, science, worldview of Europe and America, led to the emergence of new peoples, cultures, societies, but also became the cause of irreparable losses for the native inhabitants of the New World. Immediately after the discovery of America, the personality of Columbus became a subject of interest for artists, sculptors, poets, and writers. Already in the 16th century, his image appears on canvases, frescoes, engravings, and sculptures. He is depicted as a brave navigator standing on the deck among the raging waves, with a map or a cross in his hands, looking at new lands. During the Renaissance, Columbus becomes a symbol of human genius, courage, and faith in progress. His feat is compared to the discoveries of ancient heroes and sages. Poems, plays, and ballads dedicated to the discovery of the New World appear in Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, and England. In the 18th-19th centuries, on the wave of Romanticism and national self-awareness, the image of Columbus became popular again. His life was described by biographers, historians, and writers. In the United States and Latin America, Columbus became a symbol of freedom, the unification of the Old and New Worlds. and the fight against tyranny and ignorance. In poetry and prose, Columbus appears as a dreamer who suffers from the misunderstanding of his contemporaries, but does not give up and goes towards his goal. He is compared to Prometheus, Odysseus, and Don Quixote in the 19th century. Historical novels, dramas, and operas dedicated to Columbus appeared. In the 20th century, the image of Columbus is actively used in cinema, television, comics, advertising, computer games. Cities, streets, universities, ships, and brands bear his name. Hundreds of monuments to Columbus have been erected in the United States, Latin America, Italy, and Spain. For the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America 1892 and the 500th anniversary 1992, exhibitions, festivals, and scientific conferences were held around the world. Films were made, books were written, and new monuments were created. However, in recent decades, attitudes toward Columbus have become increasingly controversial. He has become the hero of not only adventure films and children's books, but also the object of criticism in works dedicated to colonialism, genocide, and slavery. There are more than 600 monuments to Christopher Columbus in the world, from Europe to both Americas. The most famous are in Barcelona, Madrid, Genoa, New York, Santo Domingo, Havana, Buenos Aires, Mexico City, Lima, and San Francisco. In the United States, the capital of the country, Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, and numerous cities, streets, parks, schools, and universities are named after him. However, since the end of the 20th century, monuments to Columbus have become the subject of protests and controversy. Activists demand that they be removed from public spaces, considering Columbus a symbol of colonialism, violence, and the destruction of indigenous peoples. In a number of cities, monuments have been dismantled or moved to museums. Since 1937, the United States has celebrated a national holiday, Columbus Day, on the second Monday in October. On this day, parades, concerts, exhibitions, and events for children and students are held. However, in recent years, more and more states and cities have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day or Resistance Day, Dia de la Resistencia Indigena, to honor the memory and contribution of the first inhabitants of America and to recall the tragedy of colonization. In Latin American countries, October 12th is celebrated as Discovery of America Day, Hispanic Day, Race Day, Dia de la Raza, or Cultural Diversity Day in Spain. This day is a national holiday, Fiesta Nacional de Espapa. History textbooks, scientific articles, museums, and educational projects examine the figure of Columbus from different points of view. Scientists analyze his diaries, letters, maps, reports of contemporaries, archaeological finds. Modern historiography strives for objectivity. It recognizes the merits of Columbus as a discoverer, but does not remain silent about the tragedy of indigenous peoples' slavery and the destruction of cultures. In schools and universities, issues of ethics, memory, responsibility, cultural exchange, and heritage are increasingly discussed. In the 21st century, a movement for recognition of the rights and dignity of indigenous peoples is growing in many countries around the world. Descendants of the Taino, Maya, Aztec, Inca, and other peoples demand the restoration of historical justice, the return of lands, and the recognition of languages and cultures. Discussions about Columbus are becoming part of a broader struggle for human rights against discrimination, racism, and colonialism. New images of Columbus are appearing in art, literature, and cinema through the eyes of Indians, Africans, women, and ordinary people. The image of Christopher Columbus has come a long way from a hero and discoverer to a symbol of a complex, contradictory era. His name is forever associated with the beginning of a new era in human history, with great discoveries and tragedies, with hopes and disappointments. with the search for truth and justice. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492 was one of the most fateful events in the history of mankind. It changed the world map forever, marked the beginning of the era of great geographical discoveries, globalization, cultural exchange, and scientific progress. From that moment on, the history of Europe, America, Africa, and Asia became a single, interconnected process. Until the end of the 15th century, the Old and New Worlds existed almost in isolation from each other. After Columbus's voyage, the formation of a single world space began where goods, ideas, people, and cultures moved between continents. World trade arose, new markets, technologies, and knowledge appeared. The discovery of America destroyed medieval ideas about the world, stimulated the development of geography, cartography, astronomy, biology, and medicine. Europe entered the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and the arts, literature, and philosophy began to flourish. As a result of the discovery of America, new empires, states, cities, and elites emerged. Europe became rich due to the resources of the New World, but this also led to social upheavals, inflation, and new wars. New peoples, cultures, and societies emerged in America, and unique forms of economy, art, and religion emerged. For the indigenous peoples of America, Columbus's discovery was the beginning of a tragedy. Epidemics, wars, slavery, and the destruction of traditional ways of life led to the death of millions of people. The disappearance of languages, cultures, and civilizations. Despite the catastrophe, many elements of the culture, language, and customs of the indigenous peoples have been preserved in their descendants, traditions, art, cuisine, and religion. Today, there is a process of revival and recognition of the heritage of the first inhabitants of America, and the restoration of historical justice. The discovery of America led to a massive slave trade, the resettlement of millions of Africans, and the formation of new ethnic and cultural communities. Slavery left a deep mark on the history of both Americas, the consequences of which are still felt today. In the modern world, the figure of Columbus causes heated debates. For some, he is a hero, a symbol of courage, discoveries, progress. For others, he is the culprit of genocide, colonialism, and the destruction of cultures. These debates reflect the complexity of the historical process, the ambiguity of the past. More and more countries and cities are refusing to honor Columbus as an absolute hero, replacing holidays in his honor with Indigenous Peoples Day, Cultural Diversity Day, and Resistance Day. Work is underway to restore monuments, museums, and educational programs dedicated to the history and culture of the first inhabitants of America. Columbus's discovery inspired generations of artists, writers, scientists, and travelers. His name became a symbol of search, courage, faith in a dream, but also a reminder of the price of progress and responsibility for the future. The modern world is the result of processes that began with the discovery of America. Today, people, goods, ideas, and technologies move freely between continents, forming a single world civilization. Cultural diversity, mutual influence, and dialogue between peoples have become the norm and a value. The story of Columbus teaches us the importance of respect for other cultures, the need for dialogue, and awareness of the consequences of our actions. It reminds us of the price of progress, the need to protect the rights and dignity of each nation, each culture. The memory of the meeting of two worlds is not only a reason for pride or sorrow, but also the basis for building a fair, open, diverse society. Recognizing the mistakes of the past, respecting the heritage of all peoples, striving for peace and cooperation. This is the main lesson of Columbus's discovery. Christopher Columbus' voyage in 1492 is not just a geographical discovery, but a symbol of the beginning of a new era for all of humanity. It is a story of courage and tragedy, search and loss, meetings and partings. The story of Columbus is the story of each of us, the story of the world we live in. Let the memory of the meeting of two worlds be for us not only a lesson from the past, but also a source of inspiration for the future, for the search for new horizons, for respect for diversity, for building a world in which there is a place for everyone.